Alrighty, so I've got a fun one here for you. This is going to be a video about all the set 1, 2, and 3 leaders that I think are getting help with the release of Jump to Lightspeed. So a lot of leaders are getting some support, and I'm going to talk about all the new cards that I think are going to buff some of the old archetypes. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button, and if you haven't yet, do check out my Patreon if you're looking for some more content from me. All right, so the goals here, like I mentioned, we're going to discuss the set 1 to 3 leaders that will improve with Jump to Lightspeed. This is not going to be just leaders that have been meta. I've definitely included some leaders here that are off meta that are getting better. Some of them might potentially become meta, but I think a lot of them won't. But that's okay. They're still going to improve. And I think it's fun to talk about how some of these archetypes can get some help with new releases. So the first leader, it's not a meta one, and I don't expect it to be meta, but it is Hera. There are a bunch of new Spectres coming out, and some of them are actually pretty good. Like, I think the Hera Syndulla pilot card is quite powerful. Ghost is an interesting card. It's calls out all the Spectres, right? It looks like a pretty fun build around. I don't think this deck as a whole will become very powerful. I think the main issue with Hera, as with a lot of leaders, is that she simply as a leader is not very good. It's a 6-cost deploy with 4/6 stats. You get those stats on 5-cost deploy leaders. You get better stats on 5-cost deploy leaders like 3/7s. And of course, you are giving up an entire leader ability just to be able to play these off-aspect Spectres. But you can definitely build a better theme deck now than you could previously with the addition of some of these cards. I think usually Hera wants to, like, the benefit of being able to play all this off aspect stuff means that you get penalized less from playing a monocolored deck. So like a mono green Hera now has just a bunch of cards that it can include with the addition of these, with the addition of all the Spectres that have been released since the original set. And there are some powerful cards. Sabine's Masterpiece looks like it could potentially be really interesting, especially with Ambush. So like you would look at something like Energy Conversion Lab with Hera. If you're able to like stick in a couple colors in play, like a green and a red, for instance, you can do some crazy stuff with Sabine Masterpiece, especially if you give it Ambush. Ghost being like a cool little finisher that like spreads out all the keywords. Just careful of bounties because those would also spread to all your units. But overall, Hera will definitely improve with the addition of some of these cards. Become meta, unlikely, but you know, doesn't mean it can't be a decent deck. Next up at 15, I've put Darth Vader. Less cards here to really include as a specific Darth Vader buff, but I think No Disintegrations is a pretty cool card. With his ability, he kind of turns it into yes disintegrations, right? Between 4 costs, you can now kill any non-leader unit. Of course, it's a little slow. It requires 2 actions, which is not always clean, especially if your opponent is able to get the attack off with their unit, or even worse, heal or shield it before you can finish it off. But it still looks like a pretty good synergy with Darth Vader. You get Resupply Carrier potentially in a green version of this deck too, which means on that 6 resource turn, you can surprise flip a Vader by playing the carrier, going to 7, and then flipping your Vader a turn earlier than your opponent might expect. So I think in general, this Resupply Carrier could be buffing a lot of green villain archetypes, depending on if they're like big ramp decks, which Vader tends to want to be. So just between these couple cards, I think he might be getting a bit of a boost. And, you know, with the release of Luke and Vader showcases coming as a prize at sectionals and regionals, it might be time to start looking at Vader and trying to make him as competitive as possible. All right, at 14, we got Han Solo, number 2, so young Han, and here, the main call out here is Poe Dameron. I've included Blue Leader on this list as well. Blue Leader, I've included it on almost every hero deck, to be honest. The card is very powerful. Of course, being able to reduce it by 1 cost means that like you can now ambush for 5 for 4 cost on the ground with this card and get like a space version of Cloud Rider if you need it. But Poe Dameron is really I think Poe overall has not looked to me like an incredibly powerful card, but with Han, his ability to get this guy out a turn early, and then if he hops into the ship with his effect, that damage that he took from Han's ability just gets wiped away. So for 3 cost, you can just make a 4/5 space unit, and that's pretty powerful. You can also make a 2/2 space unit and put him on another vehicle and still get 4/5 worth of stats the turn you play him for 3, as long as you are not keeping him on the ground as a 3/1 unit. And I think both of those things make him quite powerful in a Han deck. I don't know if Han is getting enough help overall, but his leader ability still remains very powerful. Resource cheating is just a good thing to be doing, and with the addition of some of these cards, might be able to jump back into some meta decks. All right, next up, the meta Sabine getting some power. We got a bunch of new green cards. Blue leader I already mentioned, but Chewbacca is probably the biggest get for a Sabine deck. You know, all those curves where you're used to like space unit into wing leader. I mean, Chewbacca is that, but more. +3/+3 is insane. Being immune to bounce and defeating removal is also insane. Chewbacca is going to lead to a lot of non-games, not just in Sabine, but like in basically any aggressive deck that can play a Chewie on turn 2. I don't love the card overall as like a gut check on a lot of strategies, but yes, any turn 1 vehicle into turn 2 Chewie is going to present a major problem for a lot of strategies. A lot of decks are probably going to need Tarkin Town to be able to like deal 3 to the unit and then kill it, or, you know, find other ways to get through this. Damage removal does work on it, but the unit is getting +3/+3. Chewie is definitely going to lead to a lot of like game over on turn 2 situations. Sabine can utilize it very well. It might need to push a little more into space than it has typically. It really is not a space aggro deck. It is very much an ground based deck with a couple space units, but to do the Chewie thing, it probably would need some more. Phoenix Squadron A-Wing is a potential new space unit that it can include. Luke does a Chewie impersonation, but you know, of course, is more easy to interact with, but when they do interact with it, you get a unit, so not too shabby there. And all these cards are rebels as well, which means that wing leader and fleet lieutenant stuff will still be quite powerful. So Sabine getting some buffs in the green hero department. And we will go to the next one because it's basically the same stuff. It's Leia. It's all the same cards. I've also included the Leia unit here as well. Yeah, like all these cards are good and they are all rebels. Will we get to a critical mass where Leia can somehow be better than something like Sabine, or maybe something like Poe, the new leader? I don't know. She is in green, which means to play ECL, you need to stay in mono green, but that might be an option now with how much new green powerhouse cards we've gotten in the rebel department, that maybe we just do stick in that mono green, keep the ECL, get to play something like Command, and try to play that kind of game. I don't think you can really do the red green as well as something like Poe or Sabine can, because they get to play Energy Conversion Lab, which means they get to play Poe and Wrecker, and it's going to be very hard to justify playing the same version of that deck just without Energy Conversion Lab. But if you compare it with another color, with the addition of all these green rebels, Leia might be able to get a bit better. Well, she'll definitely get a bit better. She might be able to like push into some more competitive gameplay. At 11, I've put Mandalorian. The cards here are actually less the important stuff, but mostly the pilot mechanic as a whole gives Mandalorian a bit of a boost, because there's a bunch more upgrades you can play now. And without clogging your deck, right? So originally there's like big tension of needing a bunch of upgrades, which means it clogs your event and unit slots. But now your units are upgrades a lot of the time, which means they are split cards. You get to play them in as units or upgrades. And when you play them as upgrades, for instance, R2 kind of crazy with this, right? Because R2 is a 0 cost upgrade, and then bam, you just exhaust a unit. I think the Mandalorian, if you stick in mono yellow, can also be absolutely crazy, but you don't even need to be in mono yellow, because as a pilot, he can exhaust a unit in space off of his piloting ability and hit another unit with the Mandalorian's leader ability. Razor Crest looks interesting in this kind of deck where you try to upgrade it. You get a bounce and an exhaust at the same time. So there are some cool interactions here with Mando. Of course, you are just trying to stall. Of course, you are playing a 6-cost leader, which we know is not always the best place to be when you get very similar stats at 5 cost for most of the time. But the pilot mechanic as a whole does work really well with the Mandalorian leader. We have to see if it's too much of a liability to be focusing so much on pilots when upgrade hate could be more prominent or bounce effects will be more prominent. But he's getting a bit of a boost, so we'll see. At number 10, I've included Count Dooku, and Count Dooku did not really hit the mark in set 3. The problem, of course, twofold. The exploit payoffs, not that great. Of course, his cool thing is that you don't actually need to play that many exploit cards because he can just give your Separatist exploit. So then what was the problem? Well, the problem is most of the Separatists weren't very good either. The best card was the Count Dooku, the blue one from set 1, but overall, just that resource cheat did not compensate enough for the fact that you had to play maybe some subpar cards to get his theme working, like all the units that made exploit turn on, as well as not getting enough payoffs. But where is he maybe getting better is with the addition of these 2 new ships, Invisible Hand and Invincible. So Invisible Hand is really interesting because it just floods the board. For potentially 4 cost, if you exploit it, right? It's a Separatist. You can bring in out a 6/6, go fetch a droid. I put Swarming Vulture Droid here as a potential card to get out. You can also get out the there's a 3/1 Sentinel Droid in yellow that it can go fetch. You mostly do want to play 2-cost droids. There's the 2/3 that gets bigger if you control other Separatists. So there are a few. So Invisible Hand being able to do it on play and attack is interesting. If you play something like Triple Dark Raid with this card, it means you can get both halves of it, really add units to the board. So Invisible Hand is a pretty powerful card here. Its main issue is that the 2-cost droids aren't very powerful. There aren't a ton of them. Like, Swarming Vulture Droid might be the thing. I don't think the card's particularly powerful, but, you know, maybe we just actually just try to play like a Dooku aggro deck. But Invincible is the other one, and Invincible, because you always control a Separatist because of Count Dooku, the leader, this just costs 5, which means with Dooku's leader ability, you actually make it cost 3, which means you can play this on turn 2. You can play a 2-cost 6/6 as long as you have anything to sacrifice, and there are a bunch of fodder units. You can play them in green, and at that point, that's just like here. We talked about Chewie presenting like a massive threat. This does that as well. You're very rarely going to get the 1 deploy effect off of this because Dooku is a 7 deploy. But between Invincible and Invisible Hand, I think we've gotten quite a lot of like power to this effect with Count Dooku. So it's interesting to see if he can like really dig into this, because playing him with like something like blue just ended up not really working out too well for him. But maybe yellow is the answer. At number 9, Grand Moff Tarkin. Similarly to how we mentioned Leia getting a bunch of new rebels, well, Tarkin got a bunch of new Imperials. You just look at the power level of these Imperial cards. You've got a Director Krennic, very good card. Iden, Krennic Shuttle, Victor Leader, Onyx Squadron Brute. These are just solid units to be playing in general, even like without Grand Moff's ability. But you can, especially with these shielded units, you buff them up. That can be pretty scary. Tarkin, you know, he wasn't like bad. I don't think he was like top meta stuff, but he definitely has some game to him in like these blue-green shells. It's very different than how the ones like Krennic and Kira play out. It's definitely more geared towards pushing damage, although it does, of course, play the good like blue-green villainy controlling stuff, but with the added twist of being able to pressure more. And these cards definitely help that strategy. Victor Leader has been a very impressive card in general, which can definitely help like synergize with Grand Moff's ability to just like push damage by making small weenie units more powerful. So yeah, this guy got help, and I think we'll see if how much it can diverge from like the traditional blue-green shells into a more like aggressive tempo-based deck. All right, at 8, the top dog of set 3 and potentially the top dog of set 4, it is Han, and he does get help. Put a couple green cards that we've already talked about here with Blue Leader and Chewbacca, so there is some world where you just where the green version gets buffed as well. Blue Leader on turn 1, in addition to Falcon on turn 1, can really put a hurt on anyone trying to lead with a turn 1 space unit. You now have 6 cards that can basically one-shot most space units. Chewbacca creating this unfair turn 2. But past that, a lot of new yellow hero cards. Jam Communications is a wild card. I don't necessarily think it's a main deck card, but that is a very, very dangerous effect in this game. 1 cost hand disruption really goes nicely with all the other hand disruption that this color or this hero yellow already has. Mandalorian is a very good card. It does give Han a bit more bulk on the ground than it might have been used to. The new Han Legendary, the Piloter, good card. You could potentially include more Falcons in your Han deck if you wanted that. Although I don't think his ability necessarily means you need more Falcons. Like most of the time you end up going face when you use him anyway. You're not usually looking to trade into other space units, but there is that added benefit. Ahsoka, potentially, I think we'll see a deck later on this list that Ahsoka will shine in even more, but she is potentially decent here, although I don't think she's better than Kira for a Han deck. But, you know, I included her because, you know, there's a shot, but overall, it's not like this deck is shifting majorly. It's just getting some small power boosts, but it's already in such a good spot with DJ in the deck already. You present very, very tricky situations for your opponent, especially in a set right now where a lot of people are just trying to play space or do like giant ramp stuff with Piet. I think this deck is already like pre-built to kind of dominate those strategies. And if you do not, like I'm just telling you, when you're trying to build to beat Han, you have to remember that like they're mostly doing things on the ground, and if you can't interact with that, you will lose. You will not race this deck by going space aggro. It's just never going to happen when they have Falcons to kill your plays, when they have Cunnings, and when they present Tech and DJ on the ground. I don't usually say Tech is the main issue with this deck, but when all you're doing is playing in space, you will get Tech DJ'd out of games. So very much remember this deck exists, unless we get some announcement where something gets changed. This, I think, will be the #1 deck going into the next set. It's getting not the biggest buff in power, but it is getting some, so keep an eye out. All right, at 7, Luke Skywalker original version. Some cool cards here. I think You're All Clear Kid looks like a very powerful removal. These decks often had a little bit of an issue early with space unless they drew their space sentinels, and 2-cost removal is just incredibly efficient. It's just something we haven't really had. We were given 2 in this set between You're All Clear Kid and the red one that deals 3. You're All Clear Kid definitely has some upside, especially if you start on the ground and you have some way to buff your unit with that extra experience can really get out of hand. Luke Skywalker, having more targets for Luke's lightsaber is actually really, really powerful. Against a lot of decks, like a 6/3 shielded Luke early in the game can be great. Blue Leader, another important card for a strategy like this that is looking to interact early. This gives you option to interact on space and in ground. Real cool. So having said all that, I do think Luke got some powerful cards and tools, and I'm also interested, the same way I mentioned Darth Vader, there's going to be a Luke showcase that's part of the prize pool for sectionals and regionals. So it might be an interesting time to start brewing with him going forward. All right, number 6, an old favorite, Boba Fett hero version. So my mono ambush strategy definitely getting some help here. Tons of new ambush cards. Blue Leader we mentioned, but Eager Escort Fighter being able to ambush for 5 for 3 cost. That's just removal, right? It's never living whatever it's ambushing into, but that's pretty cool. X-34 Land Speeder is an interesting card. If that card can survive as, like, it's a 3/3 ambush, if you can actually get a 2-for-1, something that Cloud Rider never could, that's pretty powerful. Han Solo has Ambush. Fireball and Contracted Hunter, although they will still have the negative effects of Boba, can definitely punch up their weight. Like Contracted Hunter being able to ambush for 5 on the 3 cost means that all those 3/5s that are very, very difficult to remove are removable. You of course you lose the unit, right? But if your whole goal is just to keep the board clean early, then these early ambush units can really help. So ambush being the best trait in my opinion, or keyword for Boba's ability, is getting a huge buff with these cards, and I don't think they'll all end up being included, but there's just a lot going on for a mono ambush strategy with Boba Fett. I do think his ability is pretty powerful. He does get to play Boba's armor. These are all interesting things. I just wish the Fett's fire sprays that we have were in heroism. They're both villainy or double red. But yeah, for the most part, ambush, ambush, ambush. I think a lot, if you can start turning these cards into 2-for-1s, that's when you really, really start to take off, because you kill a unit, you keep one behind, and you really escalate your strategy from there. All right, number 5, Gar Saxon. This is the mono shield deck, and the mono shield deck is getting a lot of power. We mentioned Krennic, his shuttle, and Iden already with the Imperial package, but those are all kind of crazy. Director Krennic especially, in addition to Crafty Smuggler and Dr. Evazan, you now have 9 units you can play on the ground with a shield on turn 1. That is a lot of pressure. The +1 with the shield is so good. You get an extra 3-drop now with the Outer Rim Outlaws. That comes down as a 4/3 shielded, right? Iden being a versatile card that not only can be a 5/3 on the ground, it can also just buff something +4/+3 because it is an upgrade itself that leaves behind a shield. The Boba Fett pilot as well can do something like this, and he's shielded on the ground as a 6/4 if you want to do that. Gar's ability to make all these shielded units +1 power is very powerful. He is a bit of a slow leader, but you're really trying to usually end games on the flip turn. He is not meant to like carry you as a leader deploy. The shuttle is also shielded and can move shields around. It's just shields all day. I think the strategy has some legs as a whole. It wasn't a weak strategy before, and yeah, like these are good cards to include in a deck like this, and it's definitely got some potential moving forward. At number 4, I've included Emperor Palpatine. So for the most part, what I want to highlight here is the bases. This is like what he wants. He wants more health, and he can do it either in mono green now or with blue, and those are 2 places I would look to including these new bases. Surviving longer is all this leader cares about, because if you are able to get to your flip turn and do your mind control and steal a unit and stabilize off your 410, you're okay. The problem is a lot of time you don't have enough life to do that. So let's see, does +3 life or +5 life make it happen? Possibly. You also get the resupply carrier, more ramp. Never bad for an Emperor Palpatine. Got some new cool blue tools as well. A couple on death triggered 2-drops like the Desperate Commando, which with Emperor's ability can deal kind of 2 damage to something, right? With his ping and his -1/-1. You have a heal ship. That's nice. No Glory is just a very powerful new removal, just like a much better version of Vanquish for the most part, that can get rid of pesky when defeated things like K2 and Ruthless Raider and such. Also can steal a Chewbacca pilot and kill it. Chewbacca pilot. Overall, the key here is the extra health. We'll have to see. Don't really know yet how to like completely build around Palpatine in a wide open field. You do typically need to build your reactive decks after you know what you're reacting against, but there's definitely some hope here that with all this extra health, Palpatine can make some waves. All right, at 3, Quinlan, a deck I really liked in the previous cycle. Not getting a ton of new cards, but getting some very important stuff. So Ahsoka, this is the deck I was mentioning about Ahsoka. This fits so well into this deck. The deck is already a disruptive discard deck, and now it gets to front load that discard with Ahsoka rather than needing to play something like K2. And K2 could still be a viable card, at least out of sideboards against like controlling decks, but now you can front load that discard, which works so well with things like Spark and Force Throw to really, really break up your opponent's hand. And the kicker here is the unit itself is a force unit, so it turns on that Force Throw, 5 health, an important break point. And even that exhausting ability with Ahsoka makes opponents' discard choices much more difficult or potentially game breaking if they have no events in their hand and have to toss a unit. Red 5 is another solid 3-drop. I think this slots in really well. The stats are just where we want them to be, and that on attack makes life really awkward for your opponent when you are able to throw around pings with Quinlan's ability. So this looks like a solid slot in over something like Red 3, which although is really powerful against some decks, is often a card we weren't really interested in playing out because of the 2-3 stat line. In addition to that, Anakin here, I don't know if he makes the final cut, but he's certainly an option as a 2-drop force unit. I don't think the piloting effect is that relevant. It's not very powerful, but instead of something like Grogu, which had no power on the ground as your only 2-drop force unit, you now can just play a 2-3 that turns on your Force Throw. So there is some play there. Jam Communications, I mentioned this already, not necessarily a main deck card, but does fit in really well into a deck that is already trying to break up an opponent's hand between all the hero red, yellow discard effects. So Quinlan, one of the decks that I think is most well positioned leading into this new meta. It got some tools. It was already solid, so looking like a good choice. At number 2, Cad Bane, one that I didn't think was too well positioned towards the end of set 3, primarily because I just thought the Django matchup was awful, and once the Han players also figured out that all they needed to do was keep your board clear until they could DJ you, that matchup got harder as well. But there is so much help in the Underworld theme. I didn't even include all of them because just like it's too many cards, but I did pick up some highlights. IG 2000, we talk about this card as a Django card, and we will talk about it in a moment, but it is also Underworld, which means you do want everything, and you can do an extra one with Cad's ability. It's a pretty solid effect. Sidon Ithano, finally a card that can kill Lurking TIE Phantom just incredibly cleanly. It's for 2 cost. Was one of the absolute worst nightmares for Cad Bane, and there is a clean answer now. Now, I don't know if Lurking TIE Phantom is going to be a popular card moving forward because of how much new space cards exist, and it's just a 2-2, and it does not brawl well, but this card also being an Underworld means you can play it as a 2-2 on the ground and ping on turn 1, which means you're triggering that Tarkin Town, or it can just trade into any 3-3 or a 3 health unit that was played on the ground because of that effect. So there is a lot of utility there. Boba Fett, even when played as an upgrade, triggers Cad Bane's ability, and there's a lot of transports. There's 4 of them just on this screen alone, right? All 4 of those space units, and that means you can deal 2+1 with Cad Bane's ability. That's pretty powerful. I've included some of the new 3-drop space units, like there's a 2/4 Sentinel, which I very much would prefer to the Black Sun, which was a 3/2. Houndstooth and Mist Hunter are both interesting. Mist Hunter especially because the deck is filled with bounty hunters. Might be able to trigger that on attack, and of course 3/4 stats. We were basically just playing Punishing One in this deck and not ever really triggering its effect, just because it had stats in Underworld, and Mist Hunter, I think its effect is probably more reliable, although Punishing One also gets a bit of a boost these days because there's going to be more units with upgrades, so you might be able to trigger it more frequently. But Cad Bane definitely getting help, especially in the space department, which is something that it was lacking a lot of agency in. So there's definitely some potential for this archetype to improve. All right, last one that is improving. Django, already one of the top decks leading in to this set because, towards the end of the last set, it was obviously one of the best decks, and it is getting probably the most help out of any of the top dogs from the previous set. IG 2000 being the number 1 thing most likely. This card is insane with Django, being able to exhaust an entire board once he's flipped. War Juggernaut does it too, and it costs 6, remember, so that's that fabled TDR number where you can play it on turn 3. with TDR, and like we did with Ruthless Raider, but even better if you can wait until your flip turn to do this, because this legitimately can exhaust the entire board and then become monstrous. Like, this might actually be better than Ruthless Raider when Django is deployed as a TDR target, because this will push more than 6 damage likely, which is what Ruthless Raider does, and it will exhaust every unit. So IG-2000 and War Juggernaut, we are about to potentially enter a world that we didn't see before, which is how crazy is it when Django is deployed and has cards like this. In the previous set, there was no way for Django to exhaust an entire board. On his flip, you needed to do weird things like exploiting with the patrol fighter or something, and like blowing up a Ruthless Raider and a P-38. Or it was not clean to ever exhaust more than one unit with one action. But now you can exhaust multiples with one action, and that is very, very dangerous. So both of these cards, huge buffs. It's actually kind of wild that with Juggernaut in the deck now, Fett's Fire Spray might be the like worst of the 6 drops between War Juggernaut, Ruthless Raider, and Fire Spray, and might get trimmed because it's just a lot of 6s. Then we can go down. I put Captain Tarkin here, although I don't necessarily think it's a card that ends up making this list, but there is a world where if everyone is just playing in space and he's allowed to just sit there and buff all your units, that he can be powerful. Devastator, though, this is another wild card, and particularly when you have triple Dark Raid and sneak attack, right? So represents 13 damage from hand with triple Dark Raid if you TDR it on the 6 resource turn. This gives Django kind of a new thing, which is, oh, the game went long and I can just insta-kill you with this card, right? It didn't have that before. It had no great ways to just like slam the door the way something like a Devastator does. And Devastator with TDR and sneak attack is a violent amount of damage. It also, interestingly, can exhaust the entire board as well if Django is deployed. And it just gives a lot of reach, right? Even just playing it, you can do 4 to your opponent's base, right? So you're now in situations where you get close to beating your opponent, but they're starting to stabilize. And, you know, this deck was already pretty good at like getting some extra reach damage between Ruthless Raiders and like Daring Raids or whatever else reach they were playing. But you just have more now. You have a card that can deal 4 to your opponent's base and present a giant threat. So even if you're not sneaking it out or triple Dark Raiding it out, it can do crazy amounts of damage. It does change a little bit of the overall math with your triple Dark Raids. Like, are you trying to keep them in your hand a little longer so that you can play this? There is room to do that now, because before, this deck did not have a good 4-drop. So triple Dark Raid was often the best thing it could do on turn 3, but with IG-2000 in the deck, it does have a real 4-drop now. So are you able to bridge your turns a little better and not need to fire your triple Dark Raids early? If you're going to play Devastator, you probably do want to just play all 3, because you're going to need to resource them early, and you want as many copies in the deck as possible to find them with triple Dark Raid. So at least in early testing, that would be what I would try to do. I would try to dig into this Devastator stuff and see if it works. But it's probably not as auto-include as the 2 on the top here, but so far it looks like a very dangerous card for this archetype. So Django, I have put him here as the #1 beneficiary of the Jump to Lightspeed set. I think these cards make him really, really powerful. Doesn't mean that he's going to be broken. He will still need to find ways to interact with other strategies like ramp decks, especially ramp decks like Piet that can put giant space units in front of you very, very early. But overall, it is a deck that I would very much keep an eye on moving forward. All right, that's what I got. Let me know if there's any leaders I missed that you think are improving. I'm sure there are some other ones. This is just what I was able to come up with. And yeah, love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, take care.